Welcome to the Explainer. So picture this. You've just finished an absolutely grueling day. You walk into the kitchen and find yourself staring blankly into the fridge, desperately seeking comfort in a pint of ice cream or maybe a bag of chips. Well, if that sounds familiar, you are definitely not alone. Whether you're navigating the intense pressures of grad school, kicking off a brand new career, or, just trying to survive daily life, turning to food when we're stressed is incredibly common. Today, we're really unpacking the reality of emotional eating. We're going to dive into the science of exactly why our brains do this, explore some fascinating clinical solutions that literally reprogram the habit, and talk about how to maintain healthy coping mechanisms for the long haul. Let's get into it. Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The emotional eating trap. 2. Why we emotionally eat. 3. The DBT solution. 4. Mindful habits and coping. And finally, 5. Preventing a relapse. All right, section 1, the emotional eating trap. Before we get into the heavy science here, let's be real for a second and just normalize something. Using food as a reward, treating yourself to celebrate a win, or just enjoying a good meal to unwind after a long day is a totally universal human experience. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it turns into a mindless cycle, well, that's when we can start to feel totally powerless. So we really have to ask ourselves a pretty crucial question. Are you physically or emotionally hungry? I want you to think about your own daily habits for a second. Do you catch yourself eating when your stomach isn't actually rumbling? Are you using snacks to literally swallow your sadness or frustration or even just boredom? Getting brutally honest about your own hunger cues is the absolute first step to untangling your relationship with food. There is a remarkably clean contrast between these two types of hunger, and the Duke Graduate School breaks it down perfectly. Physical hunger builds up gradually, right? It's tied directly to biological cues, like a drop in blood sugar, and usually your body tells you it needs fuel every few hours. But emotional hunger? Bam, it hits you out of absolutely nowhere. It is explicitly tied to this sudden, intense urge to soothe a negative feeling, whether that's sadness, anger, boredom, or anxiety. Understanding that fundamental difference is a total game changer for catching yourself before you slip into mindless eating. Moving on to section 2, why we emotionally eat. So, why do we actually do this? What is happening in our minds that drives us straight to the pantry? To really understand it, we have to talk about something called emotion dysregulation. According to a really fascinating study from the Kairos Institute, this essentially means getting totally overwhelmed by intense feelings. Their research zoomed in on women in what they call emerging adulthood, basically that chaotic transitional period between ages 18 and 25. Think about it. This is a time of massive identity exploration, crazy academic demands, and unstable relationships. All of that transition triggers high negative affect, which makes us incredibly vulnerable to seeking out temporary comfort and a sense of control. And food is a really easy, instant way to get that. When you look at the most common triggers, sure, major life transitions like moving to a new city or going through a tough breakup are obvious culprits. But notice what else is on the list: procrastination, exhaustion, and loneliness. It's wild, right? It's often the countless tiny daily stresses that slowly build up. And when we use food to cope with those everyday annoyances, it usually creates this really nasty cycle of shame, guilt, and self-disgust, which ironically just triggers even more emotional eating to deal with the shame. It's a tough loop to be stuck in. Which brings us to section 3, the DBT solution. Okay, so how do we actually break this cycle? Enter a highly effective clinical solution: dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT for short. Now, DBT was originally developed to treat severe emotion dysregulation in borderline personality disorder, but researchers have discovered it is incredibly effective for emotional eating. And here's why it works where standard diets completely fail. If you are swept up in a tidal wave of emotion, you literally cannot logic your way out of craving food. You can't just challenge your thoughts. You have to learn how to regulate the underlying emotion first. And that is exactly what DBT is built to do. The Kairos Institute study breaks DBT down into 4 really solid pillars. First up is mindfulness, just observing your emotions without judging yourself for having them. Second is emotion regulation, figuring out what your emotions are actually trying to tell you and actively working to increase positive ones. Third is distress tolerance, finding adaptive, healthy ways to survive painful situations without immediately turning to food. And fourth, interpersonal effectiveness, learning how to communicate better because, let's face it, conflict with other people is a massive, massive trigger for stress eating. And the data from these single-case experiments, honestly, it's pretty incredible. Take a look at participant A. After going through the intervention, her total emotional eating scale score dropped from a 64 down to a 38.
That is a massive 26-point decrease. She literally moved down 2 full categories, going from high emotional eating all the way down to low. Participant B saw really significant decreases as well. It proves the concept perfectly. When you treat the emotion directly, you end up treating the eating behavior by default.
Watching these trends build over time tells an even deeper story. Participant A showed this really rapid, consistent drop in how often she emotionally ate, keeping well below her starting baseline. Now, participant B's decrease was much more gradual. Why? Well, the researchers noted that participant B was actually dealing with the intense grief of a family death during the treatment, which understandably caused her emotions to spike temporarily. I think this is such a vital takeaway for us. Life happens. Individual differences and major life events will absolutely impact how fast an intervention works for you. But that downward trend still proves that DBT works, even if your journey requires just a little more time and grace.
All right, Section 4, mindful habits and coping. So we've seen the clinical data, but how do we turn those academic findings into actual life hacks you can use today? First, the Duke Graduate School strongly recommends a 15 to 30-minute transition rule. Since we know emotional eating usually strikes right after a long, stressful day, you need to deliberately insert a buffer. Take a walk, put on some music, or write in a journal for 20 minutes before you even let yourself enter the kitchen. Another amazing hack directly from the Cura study: participant A found success using eucalyptus oil to self-soothe. Just by focusing on that really strong, calming scent, she effectively distracted her brain and diverted her focus away from the pantry. Pair things like that with some deep breathing or a simple food and mood log, and you've got a really powerful toolkit to keep yourself grounded in the present moment.
But honestly, the most profound tool you have is entirely internal. It's the psychological power of adopting a non-judgmental stance and practicing radical acceptance. Participant B in that study actually said this was her single biggest breakthrough. She realized she didn't have to agree with her negative emotions, and she certainly didn't have to like them, but she had to stop running away from them. When you finally stop fighting against your own feelings of anger or sadness, you instantly lower the immense guilt and shame that usually triggers the eating cycle in the first place. You literally just accept the emotion, let it wash over you, and move on.
Which brings us to our final section, preventing a relapse.
As we shift our focus to long-term maintenance, we really need to look at some brilliant insights from Sella House, an eating disorder treatment center. Building a relapse prevention plan means understanding that early intervention is everything. You absolutely have to know your personal early warning signs. We're talking about red flags like weighing yourself obsessively, skipping meals, or suddenly isolating yourself from your friends. When those red flags pop up, you need to immediately pivot to your healthy coping strategies. That might be meditation, doing something creative, or writing down your thoughts. Having this mapped out on paper gives you a concrete, panic-free roadmap to follow when life inevitably gets hard.
I want to highlight this specific quote from Sela House because it is absolutely crucial. A setback doesn't have to mean defeat. Please hear that. Building brand new habits and rewiring your brain will inevitably involve setbacks. You are going to have stressful days where you fall back into those old patterns. But that doesn't mean you failed. No way. It just means there's a new stressor in your life that's asking for your attention. So when it happens, approach yourself with self-compassion, not harsh, toxic judgment. And because those setbacks will happen, having a really solid support network is the true anchor of maintaining your progress. Like Sela House points out, recovery isn't meant to be a solitary journey. Whether you lean on a professional therapist, a registered dietitian, an alumni peer group, or even just one really supportive friend, having someone you can text or call provides the accountability and the validation you need to stay on track the second you feel those old habits creeping back in. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final empowering question to chew on. What soulful activity can you use to transition your stress today? We've just learned that emotional eating is really nothing more than a way to cope with dysregulated feelings. So how are you going to choose to cope today? Are you going to take a 15-minute walk outside, grab a journal, try that eucalyptus oil trick? By understanding the actual science and leaning into these DBT-inspired tools, you have the absolute power to break the cycle. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you, go out and take one mindful step forward today. You've got this.